Hello, thanks for joining us today. My name is Meredith Newmark, and I'm the Senior Director of Operations at Atlas Corps. I'll be joined later today by Mavra, who is one of our Atlas Corps alumni, and she is a monitoring and evaluation specialist. And in this webinar, we'll be talking about the basics of the Atlas Corps Fellowship, the selection process for this recruitment cycle, and tips for a more competitive application. So you'll definitely want to stay tuned for that. And then also more about the fellow and alumni experience. We'll also have a Q&A session at the end. So feel free to ask your questions in the comments and we'll come back to them later this hour. So let's get into talking a little bit about the application process and what is the fellowship. The Atlas Corps Fellowship engages leaders committed to social change in professional fellowships at organizations to learn best practices, build organizational capacity, and return home to create a network of global change makers. Fellows serve full-time at host organizations that are based in the US, addressing issues that complement their expertise. They increase their leadership skills through hands-on experience while developing invaluable connections and participating in leadership development activities. We are currently recruiting for our blended fellowships and our remote fellowships. In our blended fellowship model, fellows serve at their host organizations virtually full-time for about 1 month before continuing their service in the US for the remaining 11 months for a total program duration of at least 12 months and up to 18 months. And that exact arrival date can depend on when fellows get their visas. In our second model, which is newer and we just piloted starting last year, the remote fellowship model, fellows serve full-time with their host organizations remotely from their home countries for a total of 12 months. When it comes to who should apply to the Atlas Corps Fellowship, who should apply? So the fellowship is open to people worldwide who are not US citizens and residents and have at least a bachelor's degree or equivalent, are highly proficient or fluent in English enough to serve in an American US or American English speaking environment, and are at least or are 35 years old or younger at the beginning of the fellowship. Fellows must also be committed to living on a basic living stipend and to addressing critical social issues in their home country or region at the end of the fellowship. And if you're in the blended fellowship where you come to the US, that means that you do have to leave the US and hopefully return to your home country or region at the end of the program. We also require fellows to have at least 2 years experience in at least one of our 5 main skill areas. And if you've looked at Atlas Corps before, this is a slight modification to maybe what you've seen before in our eligibility requirements. So our top 5 skill areas are communications and marketing, monitoring and evaluation and data analysis, operations and human resources, partnership building and business development, and program and project management. And those are the 5 skill areas that our host organizations are typically looking for in a fellow. So we do ask that candidates have at least 2 years of experience in at least one of those 5 skill areas. For more details and for an overview of these skills and what host organizations are looking for, what you should expect if you become a fellow in one of these areas, please visit our website, or you can review a recording of our last webinar that we did a couple weeks ago. If you go to apply.atlascorps.org, there's a link to a page about each one of these skills. So you can, I encourage you to check those out because they have additional tips beyond even what I'll cover today. So why apply? What are the benefits of the fellowship? Well, you can gain professional experience with US-based host organizations and working with different cultures. You'll develop your cross-cultural skills. You'll engage in meaningful learning opportunities at the host. And by working with people from different backgrounds, you'll gain new perspectives and you'll be able to share your perspective with your host organization as well. And so it really develops that global competency that you might not be able to get at working just in your home country. So you'll also gain a connection to a network of 1,700 plus social change leaders from 116 countries. So it's a broad network that those are the people that you can reach out to for when you need help with something, or you have an idea, or you're whatever the case may be in your social change career. This is a network that you can ask questions of, share opportunities with, and they'll be sharing opportunities with you, and so on. It makes that journey as a social impact professional a little bit less lonely. You'll also gain access to supplemental trainings and networking opportunities. So for fellows, this means that you're enrolled in our Global Leadership Lab, which is a 200-hour leadership development series. And that includes at the beginning of the fellowship, cultural orientation and orientation to the fellowship. It includes planning your fellowship through working with our staff on your training plan, reflecting on your fellowship throughout the year. And then, of course, leadership development topics such as storytelling or peer coaching, or some of the other topics that we work on in our Global Leadership Lab, workshops and seminars and other activities that are part of that series. You'll also gain support with planning your post-fellowship career, partly through some of the activities we do throughout the year, including our transition retreat for fellows who are near the end of their fellowship, and also enrollment in different career networks that could help you with your post-fellowship planning. You also gain financial support for your basic living stipend, basic living expenses. That includes a volunteer stipend that is meant to cover shared housing, local transportation, food, and your phone plan, basic health insurance for newcomers to the U.S. So it will help with some of those financial expenses. It's not a salary, but it is enough to cover some basic living expenses. And then finally, you'll get support with your travel and visa. So if you are in the blended fellowship where you're expected to come to the U.S., we would help with your international flights and other travel, sponsorship of your J-1 visa, and we'd help you with the visa application process, which I know can be complicated. So that's a little bit about some of the benefits of the program, and we'll hear more later on from Mavra about what she found valuable. For right now, I wanted to share some tips for a stronger application. So for those of you who are working on your application, I hope you'll think about how you can apply these tips to your application. So as I mentioned, we have these 5 skill sets that are our 5 priority skill areas. These are the skills that are most in demand at our host organizations. And so our selection process is going to be focusing on those who have the greatest chance of being successfully matched with a host organization for the fellowship. And when you're filling out the skills section of your application, we ask that applicants choose one of these 5 skills in which you have at least 2 years experience as skill 1. And then if you have secondary skills that complement that primary skill set, mark them as skill 2 or 3 on your application. You can include up to 3 skills on your application, and then you can include more information about your experience throughout the skill section. And of course, I'm not encouraging anyone to choose one of these 5 skill sets if you don't actually have experience in it. You should have experience to back up your choice. But I encourage you, one of the tips that will be helpful is if you choose one of the 5 skills I mentioned earlier, and they're listed on our website as your top skill set. And then each one of those skills, whichever skill you select, has its own set of follow-up questions to dive deeper into the experience. Make sure you answer these questions thoroughly. Use examples, use statistics or keywords in your response that will ensure your application is matched with appropriate roles. Again, look at our website. It has tips about, what kinds of activities are included in communications and marketing. If that's your skill 1, look at that page and think, okay, which of the things on this page do I have experience in? And make sure you're mentioning that on your application. If you are mentioning a specific example, make sure you're relating it not only to what was your role in that example, the project you worked on, but also what was the result or the impact of that project. Highlight your skills throughout the entire application as well. So the most competitive candidates highlight their professional expertise in their skill sets throughout their entire application, including the biography, the employment history, maybe where you're talking about your social issue areas. Being specific, and including those examples really make your application more appealing. So, for example, if you're an expert in partner research and outreach, then this professional experience should be highlighted, not only in that skills section, but also in your essay or your biography, your resume, any work samples you submit. And if the application is asking for work samples, make sure they demonstrate your experience and responsibilities in the skill set, because those are required for certain skills that you select. So make sure to include that. And if you're looking at if you look at those five skill areas and you think, well, I'm not really sure what I match with, think about how you can relate it to one of those five skill sets. So even if, let's say event planning is a big skill set that you have, and where a lot of your career lies, well, that's very similar to project management, or you had to use project management skills to plan an event. So think about, even if one of these five areas isn't the first thing that came to mind when you think about your strengths, think about how can you tie your experience to that. So think about that. So that is one of my biggest tips for your application is that skills section and how to present that. A few of my other tips, relatedly, to be detailed. So your application should demonstrate your experience. If if you are vague or you only just do the very bare minimum on your application, it's likely not going to succeed. We're looking for people who are spending time on it, being thorough, providing examples, and getting detail in there. Another tip I have is about your one paragraph biography. So there's a section of the application where it says, write a paragraph biography about your career. And that is a very important part of the application. It's not only the first essay question, but it's also one of the first things that our selection board and potential host organizations see when they're reviewing your application. So think about it like you have 30 seconds to convince a host organization to accept you. You want to kind of sell yourself a little bit. Like think about your own branding. You're trying to get. If you had 30 seconds, how would you convince someone, or what would you want them to know about you to convince them that you should be an Atlas Core Fellow? Also, make sure your biography is in the third person. So instead of saying, I have 5 years experience, you would say, Meredith Newmark has 5 years experience, or whatever, in order to, because the idea is that we can use that paragraph in showing it to a host organization and present a little bit about you in that way. So there's more tips in the application itself. If you go to that biography session, if you're working on your application, there's a link saying, here's some tips about your biography. Make sure you click on that link. It will help you make sure it's organized the way that we recommend. For social issue areas, we are looking for candidates with an interest in various social issue areas. There's not necessarily a priority area there right now. What's important here is passion and experience. Provide detailed examples of your professional experience working within your interest areas. And, like I said before, think about the results and the outcomes of how you worked with that social issue area. All right. And then when it comes to work experience, while valuable professions, we do not place applicants who have most of their work experience in teaching, translating, or the law. Just because, even though, let's say you're a teacher, which is a fantastic profession in many ways, but teaching is actually a different visa. So that's part of the reason why a different visa than the one we sponsor. So we can't actually place teachers in our program to do teaching. Now, if you experience in running educational programs or, writing about education policy and reform, those would be a better fit. And so you want to make sure that you are capturing the breadth of your experience if you are in one of those areas. And same with translation. Like this is not necessarily a fellowship uh, for you to come and do 40 hours a week of translation. If it were part of your role, it'd be a very small part of your role. So think about how you can show your skills beyond teaching translation or the legal profession, or being a doctor. Okay, what could you do in an office environment? What could you do in a nonprofit kind of role? When you're prompted to fill out the application, you'll have the opportunity to take a short eligibility quiz that will help you determine whether you should apply and whether you fit the eligibility requirements. So if you're unsure if your work experience makes you a good fit for this opportunity, feel free to email us at apply@alicecore.org and we can take a look. But in general, if you have at least 2 years of full-time experience in one of these 5 skill areas that we mentioned earlier, communications and marketing, operations and human resources, monitoring and evaluation, data analysis, partnership building and business development, and program and project management, those are our 5. As long as you have at least 2 years of full-time experience in at least one of those skills, and then check the other eligibility requirements to make sure you meet them, then I encourage you to apply. And then other things to think about, of course, English. Make sure you are clear and concise. Have someone else read over your essays, especially. Even if English is your first language, it always helps to get another eye on it. And if English is not your first language, then really make sure you're checking it over carefully for grammar and spelling, using different tools to make sure you've checked it over, and that it's as polished as you could possibly make it. All right. Well, those are my major tips. Oh, and last one, to make sure you answer all prompts completely. Sometimes there are prompts or questions that have more than one part to them. So make sure you're answering everything that's included in the essay prompt or in the question. All right. So those are my major tips. And so I am going to bring on our special guest today, Mavra, who will be sharing a little bit about her fellow and alumni experience. And welcome, Mavra. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, glad to be here. Hi, everyone.
Hello. All right. Well, so we have a little bit of time to talk about a little bit about your experience. But first, I want you to start off with our Atlas Core tradition of sharing your Atlas Core 5 facts.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mavra. I was an Atlas Core Fellow from Pakistan from class 34. I served with the Transparency and Accountability Initiative as their Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Fellow. And they were based out of Washington, D.C. The social issue I'm most passionate about is education improvement and countering violent extremism. And a fun fact about me would be I have a good tea collection going on right now. So that's kind of the current fun fact. I would say it just keeps on evolving.
Fun. That sounds lovely. All right. Well, tell us a little bit about what were you doing before the fellowship and what made you decide to apply to Atlas Core?
Right. So before applying for Atlas Core, I was mainly doing donor-driven monitoring and evaluation back in Pakistan. So working with USAID, DFID, even the WHO on their monitoring and evaluation requirements. Most of it was actually set by the donor, so there was little room for innovation. It was just following laid out and spelled out MEL practices. So I was working on different projects ranging from agricultural improvement, educational uplift, countering extremism, and then finally I was also into healthcare with WHO. So that was kind of my background. But I've always been in the M&E space prior to applying for the Atlas Core Fellowship.
Excellent. And once you were accepted into the fellowship, what was your role at your host organization?
So the job description I got from Transparency and Accountability, my host organization, looked very similar to the work that I was doing before. It was about monitoring the organizational um, sort of progress. I think one big deviation was before I was doing monitoring evaluation for the field, like for a particular social issue. But with TAI, I was doing monitoring and evaluation internally for the organization and for the donor collaborative itself. And for those of you, just to unwrap this term, donor collaborative is when different donors are together as part of a coalition, and then they have a different organization which is sort of acting as their learning driver. So one organization that's helping them share resources and knowledge amongst themselves, and then all these donors form sort of a collaboration or a collaborative. So my role was to see how well this collaborative was doing internally for the goals it had set out for itself. So like monitoring its progress, how many knowledge products have they produced over time, how many donor learning calls have they done over time, what has been the result of those calls, how many trainings and webinars has the organization hosted, and then capturing all that information into a dashboard, making live dashboards with data visualizations for greater visibility within the organization as well as for our donor representatives. And then the organization was also big on producing learning products for the field. And when I say the field, I mean M&E. And that would always involve keeping up to date with what's new in the M&E space, how have people tackled different issues with different M&E techniques, what's been new, what are people talking about, uh, and then using all of that knowledge to even write blog posts of, hey, what's up and coming in the M&E field, what are people more interested into, this is a new storytelling technique, this is a new communication technique, this is a new data capturing technique. So just keeping well informed of how M&E is progressing.
Awesome. It sounds like it was a great mix of building on your previous experience while
Absolutely.
also giving you an opportunity
Two
to.
steps forward than yes, what I was doing.
Yeah.
And like I said before, in my roles, the M&E templates and reporting templates and requirements were laid out, and we just had to follow them.
Mm-hmm.
But this fellowship truly puts you in a driver's seat because you're considered as the thought leader and you're considered as the MEL expert.
Mm-hmm.
So the onus is on you to look for resources and to inform others who don't have any exposure of M&E. So that really puts you in the driving seat, and you have a lot of room to navigate and innovate with the MEL products or M&E products.
Yeah, absolutely. I always tell people the fellowship is what you make of it. So
Yeah, absolutely.
there's that opportunity to
True.
initiative. Yeah. Awesome. Well, what's one professional accomplishment that you're proud of from your fellowship?
I think with this fellowship, I really got the chance to take up a proper training on how data visualizations work. And before that, I mean, you're used to knowing about bar graphs and pie charts and whatnot, but just taking them three level up and, making complicated charts with the data that's in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
For an audience which is familiar with data visualizations and for an audience that's not. So it's just how you interpret data and make amazing visuals out of it that people can interact with in real time. And I think that is super pertinent because some of the work that I've been doing in healthcare, and right now, even with my current role with an organization based out of Canada, they're big on data visualizations because increasingly people are not super interested in reading lengthy reports. If they want to look at targets and if they want to look at what has been achieved against those targets, the data visualizations is becoming increasingly popular amongst, at least in the strategic meetings.
Yeah, it sounds like that's a skill that a lot of different organizations could benefit from.
Even I mean, I see MELP jobs being posted increasingly, and for those of you who are in this space, you might have increasingly noticed that a requisition or maybe an essential or a good to have is now familiarity with Tableau or Power BI or any data visualization tool.
Mm-hmm.
So more and more job organizations are increasingly looking for the skill set.
Yeah, those were some of the a couple of the softwares that were mentioned. If you go to our M&E page on our website,
Right.
for those of you who are applying for this role, those were a couple of the softwares that were mentioned. Of
Right.
course, applicants don't have to have all those skills, but
Of
having
course.
some of the different skills mentioned, it's going to be a plus on your application for sure.
For
So
sure.
yeah, I definitely think that's a growing area. Um, and then what were some of the challenges you faced during the fellowship, and how did you overcome them?
I think it was exactly something what I mentioned before, just that shift away from, just following a set standard practice
Hmm.
and putting myself in the driving seat, not really knowing whether what I'm doing on an experimental basis would be right or not.
Hmm.
I think that was a challenge in the beginning because I had some sort of mentorship with my supervisor, but she was considering me as the male expert coming
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
So basically, I was the one who had to seek out resources, who had to seek out others in the
Hmm.
Mel network
Hmm.
to get answers to certain questions. And
Hmm.
then I had to read journal articles and M&E articles and M&E resources to come up with solutions to the
Hmm.
problems which my organization was facing.
Right.
So just
Right.
that shift away from, hey, this is set and I just have to follow it, to versus now I have to create something. I have to
Yeah.
create something which can be used as a strategy for the organization.
Yeah.
It's quite a shift, but it really puts you in that driving seat and in that thought leadership position. So,
Yeah.
I mean, converting that challenge into something that you can present as a strength
Yeah.
was an interesting aspect of the fellowship itself. And I would say for the candidates who are looking to apply for M&E roles, also for other roles, by the way, because I think it's equally applicable, be ready to get out of your comfort zone and be ready to be in that driving seat.
Yeah.
Because if you are declaring yourself as a data expert and an M&E expert, you will be taken as such, and people will be looking to you for feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. A lot of host organizations are looking to their fellow
Yeah,
to bring their own expertise to the role, and not, just because you're in a new environment doesn't
yeah,
mean that you can't speak up in meetings and take
that's true.
initiative or present ideas.
Absolutely.
Um, so that's a great point. Um, and then, uh, we've maybe touched on this in some of these other answers, but how did you grow as a professional because of this fellowship experience?
I mean, apart from the skill set that I've discussed, I think for the when I talk about soft skills, I think communication is one. Uh, Leading presentations, leading donor calls, leading the production of knowledge products. So communication on all fronts. When I say speaking, writing, listening, of course, you need a certain level to apply for this fellowship to begin with,
Right.
but those skills are really polished when you're working in an international environment. And
Right.
when I say I was working out of DC, that means my team had people from the US.
Mhm.
There were also other fellows within my host organization. So one of them was from Kenya, one of
Mhm.
them was from Nigeria, I was from
Right.
Pakistan.
Yeah.
My supervisor from the US, the CEO was from the UK. So it was quite a different mix from within our small team. And then interestingly enough, we were hosted in a co-working space. So some of you who actually make it to the fellowship, you will realize that this is something very popular, a very popular model. So you get to interact with uh, other M&E sort of experts
Mhm.
from other organizations who are based within the co-working space. And
Mhm.
they really value feedback and exchange of information and, hey, what are you up to? And this is what I've done, just sharing of resources and just sharing of experiences. So all of that not only builds your communication, furthermore, it also builds your network.
Yeah.
So the networking opportunity that you get, and I would say, and I would encourage applicants to use this to their advantage because you never know whenever you come. I mean, this is still a very small space, dev sector, and then the M&E sector.
Mhm.
You might never know when you bump into the person you attended this one webinar with or one certification with.
Mhm.
So I think it's always good to build your network, whether you plan to return to your existing role in the host country, in the country of origin, or if you plan to take up a new assignment. Just make connections and be open to networking and sharing your experiences.
Yeah, that's so true. That the network is one of the
Yeah.
best parts of being in the fellowship. I
Mhm.
agree.
And again,
Uh,
like you mentioned, it's what you make out of it. So
mhm.
if you have an in network, it's just that it all depends on how you make use of it.
Yeah.
What value add do you bring to the network versus what you are able to obtain from the network as well.
Awesome. In addition to those sort of communication and the presentation skills that you mentioned or networking, were there any particular M&E skills that you felt were strengthened by the fellowship?
Yeah. So towards the end of the fellowship, I was assigned the task of working on a strategy document.
Mm-hmm.
And that was perhaps one of the first and rare times that I was working on how M&E should look like in an organization which is so focused on learning.
Mm-hmm.
So just not just thinking about M&E from a practical perspective, but thinking about M&E from a theoretical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was one skill that I learned and that I worked on. For example, strategy for M&E and what our data collection products look like, what will be the frequency of data collection, who will be the one doing it, how will be presented to the donors, how will the whole process flow look like. I think just going that thinking process going, it was something that I learned on how to, just look at M&E not from a practical standpoint, but also from a theoretical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So that is definitely something that I polished towards the end of the fellowship period.
Yeah.
And
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, so and I mean, fortunately, I had the opportunity to apply it immediately after I ended the fellowship and went back to Pakistan when I was working with a humanitarian organization, Care International, and they wanted a real-time monitoring report of
Mm-hmm.
whatever was going on in the field. And a lot of thinking, strategic thinking that I sort of gained, like skills of strategic thinking that I gained when I was working with TAI, they were um, applicable directly to what Care wanted from a male person.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, that balance of the theoretical and the practical, I think, comes out in a lot of our fellowships.
Yeah.
A lot of fellows say that the fellowship is a great hands-on experience that complements grad school, whether you're doing a fellowship before or
Right.
after grad school. I've
Right.
heard from a number of fellows. Of course, doesn't have to be that way, but I've heard that before.
Especially very important for fellows who have backgrounds like myself, who've been working with the different subcontractors and donors within their respective countries. Usually, those strategic documents are handed out to you, and that process flow has already been worked on and developed by someone sitting in the head office.
Yeah.
But this time, imagine working on the document yourself, and you have to be the one to create those practices for someone else to follow, and you're setting an example.
Yeah.
So what would that look like and how would you go about it? So there's a lot of thinking that goes into it.
Yeah, that's a great, shift in perspective,
Yep.
for sure. Well, since you were one of our successful applicants, do you have any tips for the application?
Yeah, firstly, I would echo what you already stated. Just be very precise and be detailed with your words. I mean, I remember when I was going through the application questions, I was already thinking as an M&E person. It's not like what you've done. It's like, if you've done this, then so what? And there's a technique called, I believe it's an interview technique called the STAR technique, which is sort of a structured method to respond to a behavior or a situational question. And when I say STAR, it's situation, what the situation was, what was going on in the background. Task is the T is task is what you were assigned. Is the action that you took on that particular task, and R is the result. Like, so what? If you took a particular action on a task, then so what?
Yeah.
I would say when you're going through those questions, questions, have this structured technique in mind and then answer the questions accordingly. And what that really happens is the person who's reading your response, they're able to understand the narrative and they're able to understand where you're coming from. And just be very precise. Don't use generalized wordings like I made M&E reports and I did M&E field visits. So, just quantify your work and highlight the success of the work. If you made field trips, if you developed reports, if you developed learning products, if you have exposure to a certain software, then so what? What happened as a result of you knowing all those skills? And because that really speaks upon what you bring to the table.
That is a great technique. I completely agree. That situation, task, action, result. You can use that on your application. If you make it to the interview stage,
Yeah.
you can use it on the interview. If you interview with a host organization, you can use it there. I think that I completely agree.
Yeah.
And so once candidates pass the Atlas Core review and interview process, they make it to that semifinalist stage. They can be considered by potential host organizations for specific roles and go through the selection process with that organization. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience interviewing with your host organization? What was it involved, and how could a candidate potentially prepare for that interview if they make it to that stage?
Correct. So, I mean, in my case, I had the first interview with my immediate supervisor, and that was kind of a detailed interview. She wanted to know my background. So, kind of a similar question to the biography question that I had in the Atlas Core application. And then she wanted to know what I was currently doing, my engagement in Pakistan, what my role looked like. And I think the rationale for asking that question was, what tools was I already using? What were some of the techniques I was familiar with? And did I have an existing experience which could be equally applicable to the requirements of a candidate they're looking for? And then she asked me why I was interested in that particular organization. Like why the host. I mean, you also get to choose the host, by the way. I mean, if the host are interested in you, and then you were asked if you're okay with taking up this assignment.
Right.
So that was kind of an interesting trick question. And my advice to those would be, if you're interviewing with a host organization, go through their website, go through the work that they've done, be very aware of whom it is that you're speaking with.
Yeah.
And then she asked me a couple of questions. She basically briefed me on how the day-to-day work at TAI would look like. And do I envision myself fitting in that particular environment? And what more can I bring to the table? So to all the fellows who are applying either for this role or others, just think about what more can you do? How can you build on this role and not carry on what's been already done? And then afterwards, after this first initial interview, I had a written assignment which involved judgment of my Excel skills and my writing skills. And then there was a final interview. I think it was more of a meet and greet with the CEO and with the remaining team members.
Excellent. Yeah, that's very common for host organizations to also have some kind of skills test or writing test or something to go along with the interview itself. So by the end of the selection process, it's a multi-step process. By the end of that process, people should be really sure that it's a good fit by that point.
Right. And also by that time, I realized that for the host organization, they were following the same recruitment steps as they were to hire someone full-time within their organization, because you will be doing all the work that a full-time employee is doing. So it's not like they're being flexible on the interview processes or the written assignments. They're going to be following whatever SOP they have for the other recruitments.
Yeah, exactly. So, for 40 hours a week for 1 year, they really want to make sure that it's going to be a good fit for the team. Even if it's still going to be a training experience and the fellow will learn from it, it still needs to be a really good match where the fellow can contribute. All right, last question before we move on to our application process and taking some of your questions being the audience. How has the fellowship enabled you to help your community either during or after the fellowship?
I think A was for those of you, when I was a part of the fellowship, this was 2019 to 2020, and right after COVID happened. So basically, a lot of so there were no field trips. There were no monitoring trips. So basically, everything had to be taken online. And one, I guess, the thing that was applicable or something that I had to do immediately was, when I was thinking about these knowledge products and learning documents and strategy documents, was something that enabled me to create process flows at my host organization, like how to go about a certain process and how those to be done. And that was something that had to be created in a COVID situation because this was something unusual. How do you do monitoring and evaluation when you can't even visit the field? Like, how do you go about it? How do you work in that particular environment? What would that process flow look like?
Mhm.
So just thinking about, um, so yeah, it's just, I guess it's just thinking about how to develop a process and how would that look like and who's going to be the one leading it is something that was, uh, uh, I had to apply that within the Mel space right after.
Yeah.
And then again, like I said, when you're thinking about strategy documents and when you're thinking about learning products for others to use, that was something that I learned during the fellowship, and I had to apply in a COVID setting, having to do M&E with others in my team.
Mhm. Fantastic. Well, I'm so glad that you were still able to continue on that work even in the COVID setting,
Yeah.
and to continue that work even forward after the fellowship, into other spaces,
Mm.
outside the U.S.
And even
So
the current role, actually, like I think the data visualization skill set that I, sort of polished upon and I gained, I am using that right now very actively, and I can see that this skill set will continue to develop and continue to be used in other M&E roles, whichever I take on.
that's awesome. I'm glad it's been helpful. Well, thanks so much for sharing your experience, Mavra, and for helping our applicants in the audience, maybe think about what the whether the fellowship is a good fit for them, and hopefully also use some of those tips. So before we get to the Q&A, and if you do have questions for either me or for Mavra, go ahead and put them in the comment section. I want to share a little bit about the application process so that if you're convinced now, I hope you'll turn in your application.
Yeah.
Um, so a little bit about the process. You can apply for the fellowship by visiting apply.atlascore.org. It's a multi-step process, as we've discussed, and the first step is to fill out an application. It's going to require a copy of your undergraduate transcript or diplomas, and contact information for 2 references. Attaching a resume or CV is also encouraged, and you may be asked to submit samples of your work to provide evidence of your professional skills. I know we talked about earlier about the skills section and things like that, so just make sure you're following those tips. Once we review your application, top candidates move on to the selection board interview stage, where you would interview with a member of our selection board, and you'd also be asked to complete an online assessment as part of a research collaboration we're doing with the University of Zurich. And then if you pass not only the application review and then the Atlas Core interview, then you become a semifinalist. Becoming a semifinalist does not guarantee placement, but it instead means that your application is eligible to be considered by our host organizations for placement. Organizations tell us what role a fellow could fill on their team. We share profiles with them, and then they select some candidates to interview. And as mentioned, when Mavra was describing her experience with TAI, if a host organization selects you, then we'd work with you on the next step to becoming a fellow. If you're not selected by a host organization, then you can be considered for the next fellowship start date in a few months, as long as you stay eligible. It can take several cycles for semifinalists to be matched with host organizations, and it's a very competitive process with about 40 to 50 fellows being selected each year. So I encourage you to get your application in soon so that we can start reviewing it and considering it for those potential opportunities. The priority deadline to be considered for programs starting in 2024 is July 30th of this year. So you have a little under a month before our priority deadline. And you also don't have to wait till that final deadline. You can turn it in sooner so we can start reviewing it. We typically have 4 fellowship start dates each year. Of course, we review that every year, but those start dates are January, April, July, and October. So we do accept applications year round, but you should apply by July 30th in order to be considered for 2024 placements, especially those in January. So now it is time to move on to our Q&A session. So I'm going to take a look at some of the comments and questions we've received. So I know some folks put in the comments Is this session being recorded and will be available on YouTube later on? Yes, it is being recorded. So you'll be able to watch it on YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn, in all three places. So many opportunities to watch and rewatch. All right. Melvin asks, how many fellows do you select in a year, especially from Africa? So it varies. In terms of the total number of fellows, pre-COVID, we had around 80 fellows a year. We're not quite back up to those numbers yet. In 2024, I expect it will be somewhere between 40 and 50 fellows, somewhere in that range. This year, it's going to be probably somewhere between 30 and 40. So that's a rough number. And Africa is probably our largest region, actually. And if you've been watching our webinars, and I know we had a woman from India last time and Mavra from Pakistan this time, that is purely coincidence. We have a broad range of, like I said, 116 countries in our network. But yeah, Africa is a very big region for us. I don't have exact numbers in front of me, but it's somewhere around maybe even at least a third of our fellows are from Africa, probably more than that, actually. So it is a big region for us, and I definitely encourage you to apply. We also got some questions from folks who made it to the semifinal stage and didn't necessarily move forward with a host organization interview or didn't necessarily get selected. And so for folks like that, I do recognize it is a competitive process. We have far more qualified applicants than we do host organizations that are looking to bring on a fellow. And so unfortunately, it is very competitive, and it also depends a little bit on luck, to be honest. So, a host organization may be looking for something very specific, and they may be looking for someone who has communications and marketing skills, can also speak this language, or they're from this region, and also is interested in this social issue area. And so you could be a communications and marketing professional, but still not necessarily fit all of those different qualities. And so if there's better candidates out there that fit that role better, even for a really qualified, excellent professional, you may not necessarily get selected by a host organization. And we're not able to give individualized feedback to all semifinalists. So that's a little bit why it might be competitive, or why you might feel like, man, I have a great profile, and why wasn't I selected? But that's a little bit of how that selection process works. It does depend on who else is in our applicant pool, what host organizations are looking for, and a little bit of luck, like I mentioned, of having that right match. So that's a little bit about how that process works. If you are a semifinalist and you're watching this webinar, I encourage you to take a look at not only the tips on the application, but also our skill set information that's on the website, because sometimes even really strong candidates who make it to the semifinal stage might be able to improve your application even more. That does not guarantee placement, but that's a little bit about ways you can increase your odds of being selected as a fellow. Mavra, I'm not sure if you remember do you remember how long it was from when you applied to when you were selected by a host organization?
I remember when maybe I've applied in January, or I don't know, somewhere in the start of the year.
Yeah.
I got an email to be a semifinalist somewhere in September.
Mm-hmm.
And then afterwards, it was super quick.
Okay.
I became a semifinalist, and I had an interview with an Atlas Score representative, and then I was matched with the host organization within maybe 7 to 8 days, and then I got a confirmation in November.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, maybe like 10, 11 months.
Yeah. So it can really range. Some
Yeah.
people might be a semifinalist for multiple cycles before
Yeah.
they're selected by a host organization. Some really outstanding candidates like Mavra get selected more quickly. Again, there is an element of just finding it's a little bit like the fable of Goldilocks. I don't know if that's an international thing that people are familiar with, but you got to find that like perfect fit. Um, and the even some it is unfortunate that we can't take more fellows because we do have so many great applicants, but no one is necessarily we receive thousands of applications each year, so no one is necessarily guaranteed a placement. All right, let's get to some other questions. Let's see. Abu Bakr asked, do you consider a national of one country working in another country for a fellowship? So not 100% sure if I understand that question, but basically if you are working outside of your home country, yes, you would still be eligible. Now, if you're working in the US, that's not necessarily what we're looking for because we are looking for people who are committed to their home country and may not have necessarily the opportunity to do a year in the US otherwise. But if you are, say, a Pakistani working in India, absolutely, you'd be eligible. Someone asks, academic referees or professional referees? Please clarify this for me. It's preferred to have professional references so that you can speak to your professional experience. That being said, we allow academic references too. Think about who can best speak to your ability to serve in a work environment, serve in an office. It's typically going to be a professional reference, but again, if you just got out of grad school, maybe an academic reference may be able to speak to more recent experience. Okay, Zakaria asked, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name. I'm doing my best. Do you have to meet the word count completely? You don't have to, but think about don't just do the bare minimum. So whatever the word count minimum is, if you were just doing that bare minimum, it's probably not a great answer. So you also don't have to get the maximum necessarily if you don't have enough to fill the maximum word count. But if you are writing strong, detailed answers that fit some of the tips we've had earlier, you're likely going to need most of that space. Again, don't fill it up with just filler just to meet the word count. And so you don't have to meet it exactly, but I do encourage detailed responses. All right, Adebayo asks, does operations and HR experience include experience in grants and financial management? That's a great question. I think it could. Take a look at those, our skill set different pages. Those are going to outline a little bit of what may be included in each of those skills. It makes me think, grants management, sometimes you may be actually doing monitoring and evaluation of that grant. So it kind of depends on like what exactly was involved in grants management. But I do believe that the financial management aspect is probably going to fit more closely with operations. So take a look. There's more detailed descriptions of each of these skills on our website, and you could sort of figure out, okay, does my experience seem like a match for one of these? Okay, someone asks, it says, I think he's talking about the application. Samuel asks, the application says I may not be considered if my application stays beyond 60 days, I think without any updates, but I started my application 2 months ago. Does this mean I could be disqualified? Not really. Basically, we have that disclaimer there for people who have their application that just sticks around for ages and ages, that we could, after a certain amount of time, archive those applications. So far, we actually really haven't been doing that much of that archiving because we want to encourage people to apply. And so even if you started your application a while back, don't worry, your application's still there. It's just more of a disclaimer so that, we have some applications in there that are someone started their application years ago and it's still there. And sort of, yeah, that sort of disclaimer that we could remove something after it gets a little bit old. All right, let me keep moving through these. I'm working for an LGBTQ organization in Africa. Am I eligible for the fellowship? Sure. If you meet the other eligibility requirements, make sure you review all of them. Mohammed asks, are people with a background in finance and data analysis considered for the fellowship, or do M&E experts have more chances? Well, if you do have an experience in data analysis, that would fit. Are technically we've labeled it as monitoring, evaluation, and data analysis. So look at that description on the website. If it fits with that role, then I think you should actually be checking off the skill set of monitoring, evaluation, and data analysis. It sounds like you might be a fit in that M&E realm, even if you're calling it more of data analysis more than M&E. And then someone from Kanyapa asks, do hosts offer salary to chosen fellows? How many, and then also secondly, how many rounds can you redo the interview if rejected? So first question about salary. So it is a living stipend. So it is not going to match a salary, and it may feel, it will almost definitely feel more constrained in terms of your purchasing power than what you got as a salary in your home country, even though if you translate the US dollars, it makes to your local currency, it may seem like a lot, but it is a volunteer stipend in the US that is only meant to cover your basic needs. So the host organization doesn't pay you, they pay a fee to host a fellow to ALISCOR, and then ALISCOR gives you those living expenses in addition to the other benefits of the fellowship. And then your second question, how many rounds can you redo the interview if rejected? So if you aren't selected, if you don't move on from the interview stage, you can reapply as many, you would have to go back to essentially reapplying and starting from the beginning. So you can do that as many times as you want. I'd encourage you not to do it more than like once a year because your experience may not necessarily have changed that much since the last time you applied. Someone asked, are people with technical profiles like engineers eligible? It really depends more if you if you do fit one of the skill sets, you're an engineer, but you also manage projects, then maybe it could be a fit. But if you were just straight doing engineering, it's may not necessarily be a fit. We're looking for people who can, our roles are typically more in the capacity building realm within an organization, more so than the direct hands-on service like the engineering, or like I mentioned, teachers or doctors earlier. So again, take a look at those skill sets, see if any of them line up with you. If you're looking to do the fellowship just for straight engineering work, it's probably not a fit. Can host organizations request fellows, or Christian asked, can host organizations request fellows to be retained for full-time work after the completion of the fellowship? And this will probably be my last question, because I know we're almost out of time. Can host organizations request fellows to be retained for full-time work after the completion of the fellowship? Only if it's outside the US. So host organizations have a restriction that they can't hire their fellow in the US for, I believe it's to 36 months after the start of the fellowship. So essentially, for most fellows, that means 2 years after the end of the fellowship. They can't hire you in the US. They can hire you abroad, or they could hire you after that time passes. But the idea is because of the restrictions of a J-1 trainee visa and Department of Labor and Department of State kind of restrictions on the fellowship, it's not meant to be a work visa or an immigrant visa. It is meant to be a training visa. Well, I know we didn't get to all the questions. So I know there were a few questions we didn't get to. I encourage you to email apply@aliscor.org if we didn't get to your question, or if you come up with another question later. But in the meantime, I want to take a moment to thank Mavra. And if Mavra, if you have any last tips or final words for our applicants, feel free to share them.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who've been part of the application process, who've been a part of this whole cycle, I would say just think of it as a recruitment with like any other job, and treat those interview questions, treat those application questions as seriously as you would while you're getting a job within the country or outside of your country. So yeah, just be focused, and it's okay if you don't make the cut. It's okay, maybe there are bigger and better things for you in your country of origin, and that's equally fine.
Mhm.
And honestly, for those of you, there are some people who did reach out to me on LinkedIn. This fellowship may be beneficial for some, maybe not so much for others. So just really think of what it is that you want to get out of it. Just be very clear with your own personal growth and your growth trajectory, and see what value add will Atlas Score have to that. Be very clear in your own goal, and then apply to different roles within Atlas Score accordingly.
Those are great tips. I completely agree with you. Make sure you're clear on your goals as part of the process. All right. Well, this is one of the 2 webinars that we've done in this cycle so far. So if you missed our first one, you can go back to our YouTube channel or our Facebook video section and find the first video that we did with one of our alumni from India, Shinjini. And then to learn more and just learn more about the process, check out our website at apply.atlascore.org and register your application account. And once you register your application account, you'll get updates from us on the application process. And then if your question isn't answered on our website or in this webinar, email us at apply@atlascore.org. And thank you so much, Mavra, for sharing your experience. And thank you to all of you for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Margaret, for having me on board this session.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.